Thank you. First of all, is this microphone working for you guys? You can hear me okay? Okay, great. Animal style. Why would I say I'll take that animal style?
In and out, yeah.
In and out, there's the reference. So what's animal style, James?
It's been slathered over everything.
Okay. Is it on the menu?
No.
Okay. Who here has ever worked as a project manager? Okay. I don't know your name in the back.
John.
John?
Yeah.
Have you ever had anything unexpected happen to you as a project manager? Say someone asking for something animal style.
Absolutely, I think that's something to be expected.
Okay, so we'll get into that a little bit more. So as Jason said, I'm Larry Seawright. I got my PhD a year after Charles did. So I think you were 2002, weren't you?
Yep.
But at a different university. So I was here, completed my dissertation, and it was reducing learning object inspection / evaluation costs in instructional design. What does that sound like? It's kind of businessy, isn't it? So what that is how can you inspect or evaluate things earlier in the process so that you spend less money. That's kind of the heart of project management. I'm currently the Associate Director for Production and Evaluation at the CTL. Who knows what the CTL is? James, don't answer this.
Oh, do I know what the CTL is?
Yes.
My wife used to work at the CTL.
Okay, so it's a place where students work.
Yeah, and she did comment classification
Okay.
for professors who were looking for feedback about what their students were experiencing in the classroom.
Okay. And where did those comments come from? Do you know?
Yeah, I think they came from the surveys that
Student
come at
ratings.
the end of the year, right? Or at the end of the semester.
Correct.
Yeah.
Okay. Anybody else have any inkling what goes on at the CTL? Please.
You work at a way for teachers to make an influential design of their courses. They talk
Exactly.
For 10 minutes or something, and then they think what the purpose is, but they let the students become and work backwards.
Right, yeah. So we have a number of consultants, most of whom actually have PhDs also from IP&T, who work directly with faculty in trying to improve teaching and learning. And that's one way of doing that. They work in conjunction with the the Faculty Center mostly with new hire orientation, but occasionally we'll get a referral from the Faculty Center. Someone needs help with, learning outcomes. Who knows what learning outcomes for IP&T are? Charles, you must, right? Jason raised his hand.
Look them up.
Yeah. So why do we have learning outcomes for IP&T? Why are they there?
Are you asking me?
I am, seriously.
I think they help us to focus our program and make sure that make sure that all of the courses that we're teaching and the experiences that we're providing to students are building towards a larger goal. Because it's easy to have course learning outcomes that aren't building towards something bigger.
Yeah. So just a little background on learning outcomes. Initially on campus, they were mandated that all of the courses and the instructors associated with those courses create learning outcomes primarily for accreditation purposes. It has evolved since then to what Charles has described, and our consultants work with faculty to help them move from, oh yeah, I've got to do some learning outcomes for the accreditors, so here's something I think is important that our students ought to learn, to when our students are done, what should they know, do, or be? And so that's where, our consultants are working. So you might be asking yourself, so Larry has a PhD from IP&T, big deal. All of you guys could do that. It's not that big a deal. You just have to have patience and endurance. Mike, you're smiling, right?
Yeah, it's no big deal.
No big deal. But it's actually true. So there are other things that can help you become qualified to talk about project management stuff. I was a navigator in the Air Force. I went through BYU and got my degree paid for by the Air Force, so I went into the Air Force and was a navigator. For the time that I was in the Air Force, I kind of was the project manager for my crew. I planned what we were doing and how we were going to do it, those kinds of things. Later, I worked for IBM as a systems engineer and then as a project manager. I had a lot of experiences there. When I was pursuing my PhD, I was actually working for Intel as a project manager, and that was an interesting job. It was primarily dealing with translation. I was overseeing the effort to translate there's like system management software that Intel has that runs inside the computer. And there are just a few things that system administrators need to have access to. But if you're not an English speaker, you need a translation for that. So we managed those translations. So one day, we were coming up to the close of a project, and we had a checkoff review scheduled with our translators. The translators in France were too expensive, so we used the next best alternative, which was translators in Montreal. Some people say, well, that's not really French, but Mike, you're smiling. Mike served his mission in France, so you appreciate that. But anyway, that's what we did. So on the day that we were going to have the final review, there was an ice storm in Montreal. How does that affect me here in Utah with my closeout meeting? They can't get to work. And this was in the days before we had Skype and things like that that were readily accessible. So we had to actually postpone things, and I was really upset because my project was now a day late. So, and I'm never late, I prided myself on that. So, but sometimes you have things like that that are out of your control. After about 2 years of juggling a lot of balls in the air, being an Intel project manager and a PhD student full-time, I said that's enough. I finished up my coursework and needed to write my dissertation, but I took a job with this small company as actually a senior instructional designer, but within just a short amount of time became their director of project management.
So for some reason, it's not showing up there.
Oh,
It flickered when when you changed screens, it flickered and went off.
oh, okay.
So maybe just the connection to your computer is, there we go.
I fixed it. It is the connection, I guess.
Okay. See,
Good job,
again,
Spencer.
another example of, uncertainty. So, yeah, this was a really interesting job. It was a small company, and they were doing everything they could to increase the valuation of the company because they wanted to go from a startup to have somebody like AT&T buy them. And so there was a lot of stuff going on. I can talk to you later about that, but I don't want to. So, what is project management? So you plan, and then there's a result. And so here's your plan, but this is the result. The difference, of course, is the gap or gap analysis. It's the difference between what the result was and the plan is. Is that, you guys just came, or many of you just came from your evaluation class, right? That's what evaluation is, right? That's what being a project manager is all about. It's making sure that the plan matches the result, and if it's not going to, let people know. The worst thing a project manager can do is have a surprise. You know, you don't want to go into a meeting and say, yeah, guess what? We're not going to make the deadline. You want to take care of that stuff as much as possible beforehand. So, are any of you invested in the stock market right now? A little bit. So 401ks, anybody? Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, so are you nervous about what's going on with the stock market right now?
I'm in my long-term mix still, so.
Oh.
The worse it does, the better Jason is.
You look like you're a little
Buying low.
closer to my age. Are you nervous about what's going on?
Not really.
Not really. What about the companies that you're invested in? Are they nervous right now? Jason, you're shaking your head. Why?
A big tank, I mean, when there's a big tank, more people panic, there's a possibility that more things can go wrong and can continue to drop, right?
Sure.
And that's their operational cash. That's where they get their money to do their jobs.
That's exactly right. And so that affects a lot of what they might want to do. They might want to be hiring more people. They might want to be expanding into new markets. And they might not be able to do that. So with less capital, how do they respond to that? Has anyone worked for a big company that's ever had layoffs besides me? Yeah. So Andy or Mike, go ahead, tell us what happened. What was the first thing that got cut?
That's a good question. It was people who had no skills,
Okay,
people that you could replace easily.
okay,
This company used to have their layoff every year just before Thanksgiving.
sounds like
And then
you're
they'd have a
talking
big
about,
Thanksgiving dinner with everybody. It was really odd.
sounds like you're talking about a local company that,
Starts with a W.
yeah. Okay.
Couple like that. It's just an
In
end.
the early 2000s, my husband worked for a software company that was really booming, and then everything fell out with the
Mhm.
dot-com bust. And he was on the quality assurance team, so he was one of the earlier rounds.
Right.
And we knew it, we
Yeah.
were planning on it,
Yeah.
but yeah, because he wasn't in the production, he was in the quality assurance.
Right, yeah. So that's great, low-cost people, or actually people who don't produce stuff. And, quality assurance, they're not really producing things, they're assuring that what is produced right, going back to, they're doing that gap analysis. One of the other things, how many of you are instructional design track folks? So where are you going to end up when you leave here? In what department of a company? Probably something to do with training or something like that. That's another one of the things that gets cut first. Yeah, well, training, it's like, okay, so we have this fancy department and they do all this training. We can't afford everything now, so we'll cut that out. We'll just put them on the line and have the guy next to them teach her how to do it.
There's a change underway for people who actually have skills in design. The companies are realizing that it costs more to hire a new person. The companies are realizing that it costs more to hire a new person than it does to train an existing person. And so, not too many years ago, PepsiCo, for instance, a very big company, moved training in as one of its 5 pillars, what they were calling it.
Wow, really?
So there is, among large companies, by the way, there's a magazine that will help you understand something about this. It's called learning officer.
Chief learning officer.
Chief Learning Officer magazine. If you look at that, you'll get the drift of this.
Ah, great. So I'm glad that things like that are changing, because if you, well, read my dissertation, you'll understand that those kinds of costs are direct. You know, they're part of that pillar. And if you can reduce those costs by doing it better, then you can do other things with reducing costs that don't have an impact on the bottom line. So, elements of the project management plan, there are 3 of them. What were we talking about when we talked about layoffs? Pretty much it's cost. So people cost money. So if you lose people, that's going to change things. Now, one of the things that you probably have already learned about is this project management triangle. How many of you have seen this before? A couple. Okay. So this is fundamental in project management. The way that triangle works, the way that triangle works is if you decrease cost and you want to keep the scope and the schedule the same, those lines, well, let me just draw that out. So we're going to, in project management literature, they actually call a cost decrease an enhancement. So you think, whoa, how's the cost, cost-cutting measure an enhancement? Well, because it reduces the cost, so it enhances your bottom line, right? So if you're going to reduce this, and so what that means is that these other lines are going to stay the same distance. If this one becomes shorter, then, and that one is the same, and that one's the same. So you can do that. Oops, I didn't do that right. But you can get what I'm talking about here. As you reduce one, if you want to keep the others the same, it makes it an oblong triangle instead of a nice rounded one like that. I mean, balanced one. You just have to shift things around. I'll give you a more practical example. At CTL, we oversee a lot of things: Learning Suite, student ratings, and BYU learning outcomes. So those are a lot of things. Who are the stakeholders, do you think, that are involved with those products? You guys are actually one of them. So do you care, you as graduate students, you probably, and here in the School of Education, you probably don't use Learning Suite. Were any of you undergraduate students that use Learning Suite? Yeah, so you were a stakeholder, right? You had some input in that. Charles is a stakeholder. He has input into what Learning Suite is like. He's a very big stakeholder in learning outcomes. Every department chair on campus is a big stakeholder in that. As professors, Charles and Jason are very interested in student ratings. So they're stakeholders on that. So in a sort of not direct way, they do set some goals for things like this. But one of the things that happens is stakeholders change those goals. For example, when, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see you other 2 professors here. I would have cited you as well.
Sorry. I don't look at those things anyway. Just saying.
He may not.
We have some new department assignments coming. Steve just begging.
Okay, so let's go back over here. Let's imagine that this line right here represents time. and it's 2 years. What would happen to this triangle if that 2 years goes to 1 year? Yeah, it changes a lot, doesn't it? So mostly what you're gonna probably have to do is change the scope, because the cost, if you're gonna try to do the same thing, the cost is either going to stay the same or it's gonna go up, but almost for sure the scope is going to change. This is actually what happened to Learning Suite. When there's a long history behind why BYU is doing Learning Suite. I won't bother going into it right now. But suffice it to say, there was about half of what could be considered a learning management system already in existence. Some folks over in the ASB looked at that and says, hey, we can save a boatload of money, and we're talking over $1 million, by switching from Blackboard to our own management system. And since half of it's built, how hard could it be to build the other half? So people who know are chuckling. Yeah, it's pretty hard, especially when, you know, the 2 years goes to 1 year. And that was a political deal. And I really won't go into that. But the stakeholders changed the schedule. They said, we've had it with Blackboard, we're canceling next May. And this was like in July of the previous year. So we had less than a year at that point to roll out Learning Suite. So those of you who were around in the fall of 2012 may know that Learning Suite was a little bumpy then. It's a lot more stable now. Things are, relatively speaking, great. Back then, students didn't notice so much, but faculty certainly did. And it was really hard for us. And that's because a stakeholder beyond our control changed things. Please.
I'm just wondering what, like a project manager, what role, I know that you guys were up against, I mean, there weren't a lot of options, but what role does a project manager have in telling stakeholders when scope or cost or schedule demands are not reasonable or realistic?
Yeah.
Right? Because, I mean, stakeholders often want everything, and it seems like it's just not practical sometimes.
Yeah, so I can give you some specifics about what I did in response to this, which involved like insisting upon weekly briefings to the academic vice president. And he actually agreed to that because I wanted him to see what was going on. And remember the thing about surprises? That's what I didn't want to happen. I told them, you know, this is going to have a huge impact. Cutting it down by a year is just going to cripple us. Here's what we're going to do, and here's how we're going to do it. So it was, you know, a proactive step. I want to have more meetings. I want to inform you. Here's what we're cutting. Are you okay with this? Not this. You know, so there was an increased dialogue. So there was a cost, actually, to that stakeholder. It was an hour out of his time every week. And if you know the academic vice president's schedule, that's a huge commitment. But he was willing to do it because he understood he had no choice. It was his boss that said, we're done. And, you know, when the president of the university says that, it's not President Worden. This was a long time ago. So when that happens, you just move on. Mike?
I'm not going to say you can always get away with this, but in several roles I've had in the last little while to overcome this problem, I have argued incessantly until I got my way.
You want to get the microphone so that the guests can hear as well?
I was able to argue that I would not allow for dates given to me by those stakeholders. but instead I would produce an engine for them, and they could set the priorities going into the engine, and they would start to see what comes out of the engine, but they were not allowed to set dates because of this problem, which is an incessant problem in project management over and over again. Because executives set dates that are just unreasonable and are politically motivated in almost all cases. So I've said no date ever, and I've had a lot of pushback. But once people see an engine producing regularly, they get to understand they set what's going in, and then they see it come out, and that's worked for me.
So when you say engine, translate that into another term.
So in software development, that would be the number of developers, the number in QA, the project managers.
So you're talking about the project plan, basically. You're automating the project plan so that they can see what the inputs and outputs are, right?
Yeah, and in the middle of that, you've got an engine. And what I say to them is that if you don't like the speed of the engine, you have to spend more on the engine.
Okay. So that's bold. And Mike, you can do it. I'm not sure if I had taken that approach with the university president, he would have said, yeah, I'll do that.
Probably not.
You would have been back in the aerospace industry.
Yeah. So, going back to this, the cost, schedule, and scope, it has an impact on quality. Andy?
Could I suggest using the word results in place of quality?
Sure.
Because very often what they want is something that works. They want to know. By the way, cheaper, better, faster. You can pick two. And the other caution that I would give students who are going to learn to work with clients is, from the client's point of view, when you first start to work with them, they don't have the vision of what you're doing. They've been convinced it's a good thing to do. But as you work with them and they start seeing results, they say, oh, and you awaken them. You basically train them, and then they start expecting things that are greater. So you've got to be very careful about pinning expectations. Because if you don't, it will almost inevitably, scope will creep. There's a term for that, scope creep. And it will always bite you in the cost.
Right. Yeah, and I appreciate the substitution of the word results for quality. That is it. Whatever it is you produce, it's at a certain quality level. It's the result of all of your efforts. And you're exactly right about scope creep. When you start a project, what do you have? Do you have anything to show them? Well, of course. What is it? What do you start with as a project?
Vision. Something on paper.
Something on paper.
A bunch of drawings.
Yeah, a bunch of drawings. And when I worked for IBM, we used to call that PowerPointware. Not software, PowerPointware, because it's just on PowerPoint. It's all conceptualized there. What we do at CTL now, we call these low-fis and high-fis, low fidelity representations, and those become higher fidelity representations. But that's what you start with. When you first show those high-fis and people are beginning to see, oh, this is what it could be, that's when the gears start clicking in. And they start saying, well, gee, couldn't we add this and add that? And it won't be that much more to do this, right? At IBM, we used to say that's SMOP. It's a simple matter of programming. So, or building or whatever it is you're producing. And what is that? It's just more money. Or it affects the schedule. Because what you're doing is you're adding to the scope. So there will be something that goes on. So let's shift gears a little bit, talking about, once again, the economy, rising healthcare costs. We have rising retirement costs. That personally affects me. My wife who also works here at the university, is retiring the end of July. I'm gonna work about 8 months longer, and then I'll retire. So I'm really concerned about that. Here in Utah, it's really hard to get student programmers because there's all kinds of competition. They can work over at Qualtrics, for example, and they'll pay them $40 an hour. We can't come anywhere close to that for a part-time student job. So how does that affect us? Well, it affects our budget. It's a static budget, it doesn't go up, it just stays there. Because of the rising healthcare and retirement costs, so if we get this much money and we have 16 full-time employees, if their costs go up because of this, then the amount of money that we have to spend on students goes down. So that's how that is impacted. And then we talked about the competition. So what that means is that I have less money available to me for Learning Suite programming or for the other projects that we are doing on campus. Student ratings, learning outcomes. Have any of you been exposed to the decision-based learning stuff that Ken Plummer is doing? No?
Most people who have taken Stats 1 and those who have taken Stats 1 and Stats 2 probably have been exposed to that
Okay.
in here. I don't know if any have taken that.
So that decision-based learning system is something that we're trying to develop that, for those of you who are unaware, which would be almost all of you, it essentially says, so here's an expert. An expert knows what he or she knows, and when they're communicating, they say, okay, I need to communicate at this level because they probably don't understand. Well, in reality, what they need to do is communicate at this level because the gap that's there is knowledge that the expert assumes that they have because, well, duh, everybody knows that. It's like in statistics, right? Everyone knows how to produce, and I'll just rattle off all those statistical terms that would make everyone's eyes roll back in their head. So, except those of you who love statistics. Okay. So that gap is what is identified and embodied in kind of a decision tree in the decision-based learning theory. So in order to do this, is this kind of an operation or this kind of an operation? And it goes up to a lower level. And we're trying to develop software to augment that process. But when it comes down to it, it goes back to the professor, the instructor, the expert, who says, okay, they need to have this level of knowledge. How do they get from this level up to here? Then once they're there, I can start building on that and expanding. So we have less money to do things like that. How many of you here work at CTL? James, you're supposed to raise your hand at that question. James, how many of you worked at CTL? So it used to be that there would be 5 or 6 hands raised. Part of the reason why we don't hire so many is because we have less money available to us. Those are real life implications of things that are external. You think, oh, I love Obamacare because, I get all this free stuff. Well, there's a cost to that. Part of that cost is affecting me as a project manager. And you think, well, yeah, no, not really, but yeah, really. I'll give you a specific example. As employees here at the university, our retirement, depending on how long you've been here, the newer employees don't get a fully benefited retirement program, which is absolutely fantastic. Andy is enjoying it right now. It's a good deal. So, plus a 401k. There's a cost to that. Partially because if you've been at the university for 20 years or more, the university pays for your, after you retire, there's Medicare, and then there's the Medicare supplement, and the Medicare supplement is really expensive unless you're a BYU retiree, and the university picks that up for you. So that's the part two. But you guys don't even care about that now. So, but anyway, there is an impact on things because in, let's see, like 2010, the ratio was for every dollar that we pay you, we're going to take 35 cents and put it toward retirement and benefits. That 35 cents is now 80 cents. And guess where that money comes from? At CTL. Remember our static budget? So that's the biggest reason why our full-time costs went up. Because so now when we pay someone $50,000, it really costs us $50,000 plus 80% more, not 35% more. So that's the impact. How would you solve that if you were a project manager at CTL? Please.
Offer internships.
So instead of hiring full-timers, use graduate students to do that.
Yeah.
Okay, Mike?
I find creative ways to automate and do things faster, better, cheaper. I mean, and there's always a way.
So what he said was he would find ways to automate and do things faster and cheaper. So, Andy?
There is a trend in the way businesses organize themselves for business these days. And they're doing a great deal more contract work. That is, they will contract with somebody for services. They will pay them slightly higher than they would pay a normal employee. But then they expect the employee to take care of their own benefits. That is, their own medical and everything.
Yeah.
It's cheaper for the employer that way. And it turns out that it releases them from a huge amount of overhead.
Yeah, that's a really important thing. Remember this thing that happened back here? The university wasn't totally insensitive to our needs. They recognized that in cutting this down to 1 year, there were going to be problems associated with that. Either the scope was going to be drastically changed, or there would be an impact on the cost. So I have 2 full-time programmers that work for me. They told me I could hire 6 contractors who worked for us for a year. So the only reason we were able to get as much done as we were able to in that 1 year period was doing exactly what Andy suggested. We went out, we hired some contractors. We weren't responsible for their benefits. We did have to pay a competitive wage because otherwise they wouldn't have come to us. But remember the stakeholders in the meeting I had with the academic vice president? The first thing I said was, we've got to do this. Can you come up with, and I gave him a number. And he said, okay. So that's another alternative, Mike, right now, is instead of doing things faster and cheaper, we can go to the university and say, we need more money. The problem right now, there are some political reasons why we can't do that right now.
But you increase the size of your engine.
Yeah, that's what we're talking about. I saw a hand over here.
Yeah, I was going to say one way that people have responded is through adjunctification, to just hire people on as adjunct faculty and then you're not responsible for their benefits also.
That's right.
And so
Yeah.
it's kind of a sour deal for people who have higher degrees and are still in a position where they're not getting paid a whole ton of money and don't have benefits, but
Right.
it's one of the way the higher ed has responded.
Yeah. Yeah, those of you who have any of you ever taught for either BYU or another university? How much did you get paid?
Well, as
If
an
you don't
adjunct?
mind.
As an
As an
adjunct?
adjunct.
Like $2,000 a course.
Yeah, $2,000 a course. I think that's still the current rate, isn't it, Charles, is that what it is? 2 or 3?
It's higher than that.
Oh, it is.
We pay more than that in the department, but.
You're a good guy, Charles. So, yeah, there are places still here today at BYU. UVU teaches a ton of their classes using adjunct, and guess how much they pay? It's $2,000. So you have to teach an awful lot of classes to make enough money to live on, which is why most people who are doing that have a job and they teach part-time, you know, which is not the best for instruction.
You can also have like fellowships. There are places that will take professors and they work 10 hours as kind of like an appointed fellow of the institute or whatever, and then you don't have to pay their full salary either.
I want to do that with student programmers. Do you think I can get student programmers to do that? No. Not when they can make $40 an hour at Qualtrics.
If you offer them food, maybe.
Food.
Provide them with food. They might.
Okay. So anyway, you can see that we're in kind of a conundrum there. Now, what is it in my title? You remember back at the beginning of the presentation, I'm the Associate Director over Production and Evaluation. That doesn't say Project Management. How many of you are going to be instructional designers? Raise your hand. Keep your hand up. You're going to also be project managers. By default, any instructional designer is going to be a project manager. How many of you are going to do anything with a job following graduation? Okay, keep your hands up. You're all going to be project managers of some sort. Do you have any questions? So I just want to answer one question. Why is this picture upright and the one that went out in the announcement wasn't upright? I don't know. Spencer, do you know?
Who sent that email? I don't know.
So this is another example of what happens to project managers. You create this beautiful document and you send it off somewhere and the picture is turned sideways. And you go, how did that happen? And Spencer doesn't know. He just put in what I said. Well, I didn't know that the actual orientation of this picture is sideways. So when I imported that picture here, I had to turn it. So, and that's a characteristic of the JPEG that I didn't know was there. That happens. Andy?
What you just said about management, becoming a manager, is really true. Someone who leaves here with a master's degree, someone who leaves here with a master's degree within 3 to 5 years, if not immediately, will become a project manager and will be working with the team. So one of the things that you could concentrate on while you're here is teamwork skills, team leading skills, and the ability to work with people, especially people who don't see things quite your way, but you need them to.
Yeah, those are very important skills to have just for any job, especially today. Almost anything that you do from this point forward you'll be part of a team. And so that ability to respectfully disagree, to suggest,
constructively solve,
to provide reasonable alternatives. So there's never just one way of doing things. Mike is shaking his head because Mike is the master of the alternative way of doing things. You should have him come speak. Maybe you have.
We'll put him on the list.
Good. Mike was a project manager that worked for me. And then went off and worked for, where'd you go first? The MTC or BYU Hawaii? Yeah. BYU Hawaii and then the MTC, and now you're off with some company making a gazillion bucks. But the reason why Mike is successful is because he, as Andy suggested, provides alternatives. The flexibility that you can develop in discussing things in your classes the creativity you can use in seeing other points of view will be key to your success in the future. So with that, I will close.
Thank you, Larry.